March is National Nutrition Month. Eating healthy with rising food prices can be challenging for families. Joining me now today is Rainie Robinson, registered dietitian at Children's of Alabama, and she's going to be sharing some tips on how we can eat healthy on a budget.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today, Rainie.
Of course, thank you.
This month is National Nutrition Month, and the theme for this month is Fuel for the Future. How can we nourish ourselves while protecting the environment?
I think something to keep in mind for making healthy choices while protecting the environment is just looking for organic or locally produced food items and produce. Especially with spring and summer coming into season, we can look for different ways to go to the local farmers market or even reach out to farmers who you may know for some of those foods that are just as nutritious but have less of an environmental impact.
So Rainie, as you can tell right now, we're in the produce aisle at Piggly Wiggly River Run. So what we're going to be talking about first today are fruits and vegetables and how we can incorporate those into our diet on a budget. So let's talk about fruit first. Why is it important to eat fruit?
Well, as you can see, fruit definitely has a lot of vitamins and minerals. We know that. But one thing that's worth mentioning when you talk about fruit is fiber. And so understanding fiber and what it does for our blood sugars really helps make fruit feel more of an important part of your diet. So when we look at something like an orange, for example, if we take orange juice, we have the sugar and the water from the fruit, but we don't necessarily have the fiber. So we're getting the vitamins and minerals, but we're missing that fiber. And what fiber can do is help lower our blood sugar levels and keep us fuller longer and help us prevent cravings and kind of like hangriness later on in the day too.
Definitely.
So looking to choose the whole fruit options is really a great choice, and especially with spring and summer like we talked about, they're all coming into season now.
And also, how can we buy fruit on a budget?
We talked about that a little bit with farmers markets. That's really my best tip, but I think places like this also have a lot of locally sourced produce already in store. Another thing is looking for things that might be marked down as like final sale. So they may not be expired, but you do probably need to get them home, go ahead and prep them, and maybe even freeze them today. And so looking for some of those things can be helpful too. But when you talk about fruits and vegetables too, there are usually three categories. So you have fresh, you have frozen, and then you have canned. And they kind of go in order of that for nutrition and nutrient value too. So fresh would be our priority, but then sometimes if it's off season and it's not that flavorful fresh, you can go with frozen, because a lot of times frozen is picked at its peak of freshness and frozen right there. So it usually has better flavor too and can be more affordable. And another thing would be canned. So for canned fruit, the only thing you want to make sure you keep in mind is you want to look for no heavy or light syrup. You really want water or juice packed. And that way you don't have that added sugar to an already sweet food and you're just eating the fruit.
Talking about vegetables, how do you shop for vegetables for your family?
Well, we eat a lot of vegetables, but I do think vegetables are one of the most underrated things that Americans kind of find it hard to get. In fact, the CDC said that about 1 in 10 Americans gets their required amount of vegetables each day. So I think it's important to make a conscious effort to bring them in, but also wash them and prep them. Because when you're talking about a budget, a lot of times people tell me, well, every time I bring vegetables and fruit in, they go to waste. And so that's not really budget conscious either. So what you want to try to do is as soon as you bring it in, go ahead and wash it, cut it, and get it ready to go for the week, so that you're more likely to choose those options when they're there, because it's easier to grab than kind of taking them out and cleaning them right then. And another thing I look for is in packaged stuff, this is a great option, but you're paying for convenience, so it's not really the most affordable option. Instead, can you find some like this where you just grab it yourself and kind of take it home and prepare it? And that really helps you to get more quantity for a larger family especially. So I think it's great to be able to pay for convenience, but don't get so stuck on convenience that you forget that there are options out there too that might be more affordable. And once you decide that, you can really start to make those changes that you're looking for. The same thing with fruit is true for vegetables. We can do fresh, frozen, and then canned. The only thing you want to look for canned vegetables is you want to try to get the reduced sodium version. And if you can't find a reduced sodium version, you can also just rinse them and drain them, and that takes about 40% of the sodium off too, making them still a good and healthy option. If you can't necessarily buy organic or certain types of vegetables all the time, it's still important to just eat vegetables in general. So don't worry about having the canned version versus the fresh version. You're still making good and healthy choices.
We're now at the meat department in Piggly Wiggly River Run, and we know protein is a nutrient our body needs, and we can get that from lean and low-fat meat. So how much protein do we need daily?
Your protein needs daily just depend on the person. A good rule of thumb though would be the size of your hand. So usually it's around 3 ounces for adults per meal, and kids is closer to like 1 to 2 ounces. So for men it's going to be a little bit more, and then for some women it'll be a little bit smaller, and then kids is a little bit smaller too. And so it really just varies. We typically don't have a hard time getting our protein sources in, but you're right, the kind of protein that you choose does matter. So when you're looking at different types of meat, chicken is a great option. Leaner cuts of meat, chicken, turkey, and then fish or seafood are all leaner cuts of meat, and then beef and pork tend to be on the higher fat side. One thing to note though is fat does give flavor. So if you're taking some of the fat away from the meat product, just be careful of the seasonings that you use and don't replace the fat with extra sodium or sugar, and just kind of add extra herbs and spices to make it more flavorful.
And what about people who eat seafood?
Seafood's a great option. A few tricks with seafood: for the environment, you want to look for wild caught seafood as opposed to farm fresh, but typically that's a little bit more expensive. And one thing I think is important to keep in mind, we're not actually by the beach, so seafood's just okay sometimes. And so if that's the case and you want to look for some frozen fish or something like that, maybe think of different ways to prepare it. Like, could you do fish tacos and still get that lean cut of meat instead of just maybe like fish with some vegetables? And that might give you some more flavor to kind of compensate for the fact that we are kind of far from the ocean.
Rainie, when we're grocery shopping and looking at dairy products, how do we read the label?
That's a great question, because looking at dairy, there's so many options. And so one thing I like to do is use a little cheat of how close can you get the proteins and the carbs. So if something is 15 grams of protein and 20 grams of carb, it's a good option. But if it's 15 grams of carb and maybe just 5 grams of protein, not necessarily the best option. And another thing to look for is added sugars. So nutrition facts labels have started including sugar and then added sugar on the label as well. So this one has about 20 grams of protein, and then it has about 15 grams of carb. And to compare, this one has 28 grams of carbs and only 5 grams of protein. And so that's how you know you're looking for a good option. It's just kind of take a second and look at that nutrition facts label and to see what you're actually buying. Another thing you can look at is the ingredients list. When you look at the ingredients list, the first ingredient listed is what that food is made mostly out of. So if the first ingredient is sugar, that food is made mostly of sugar and you probably want to avoid it. But if the first ingredient is, let's say, milk for yogurt, then you know you're getting the products you're actually buying.
Now let's talk about grains. Grains can include popcorn, oatmeal, rice, and pasta. So why is it important to eat grains in our diet?
Grains are a good source of energy for us. The good news is most people get enough grains. The bad news is they might not always be choosing the right types of grains. So when we talk about grains, we talk about 2 types of carbohydrates. And a carbohydrate is just something that our bodies can use for energy. And so with grains, you either have complex carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates. The complex carbohydrates are those kind of like the fruit that have the fiber in it and that help raise your blood sugar a little more slowly. Those are the ones we want to look for. With grains, those are really just whole grain products. You have to be a little careful with marketing though. Just because something says whole grain doesn't mean it's necessarily whole grain. So thinking back to reading a label though, we can look at that ingredients list and just make sure the first ingredient in that ingredients list is that whole grain product, and then you know you're buying a good product.
Thank you, Rainie, for sharing this important nutritional information. For more information, go to childrensal.org.